This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Leer Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a Professor Emeritus of Jewish Philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and we're here to discuss a public event that will take place at the Leer Institute on Thursday, January the 14th, under the banner of the Engaged Intellectual and Jewish Philosophy, to celebrate a lifetime of work of Professor Aviezer Ravitzky, one of the foremost Jewish philosophers in this country, who has been recovering from a terrible road accident for a good part of the past decade. One of the speakers at the event will be Professor Zev Harvey, who is joining me here today. Hello, Zev, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much, Gilad.
So tell us a bit about Aviezer Ravitzky and his contribution to this discipline. What made him the great Jewish philosopher that he is?
Well, Aviezer Ravitzky was indeed one of the great teachers of Jewish philosophy and one of the great figures in Jewish thought. During the 80s and the 90s, and until his injury in 2006, he gave one of the greatest classes in the history of the Hebrew University. This was the introduction to Jewish thought. There were something like each year 200, 300, perhaps more students who came to hear these fascinating lectures on the history of Jewish thought from the classical period until today. One of his teaching assistants in the 90s, Avinoam Rozenak, who is now Dr. Avinoam Rozenak at the Hebrew University, wrote down notes from the lectures. And the book that we are speaking about today is a collection of those lectures by Ravitzky. Mm-hmm. So when one reads these notes written down by Avinoam Rozenak, one has an opportunity to return, to visit the class of Ravitzky in the 90s, to go back to 1995 and to hear Aviezer Ravitzky.
But what was it about this special class and about Ravitzky himself that made it so special and so popular?
Well, Ravitzky is an extremely eloquent speaker, and he's learned in Jewish philosophy, in the history of philosophy, and he presents, and he has a way of presenting things in an exciting and engaged way. His class began with the beginnings of Jewish philosophy and went up to the modern period. Mm-hmm. I think what he stressed was the pluralism of Jewish philosophy. When he speaks about the medievals, he takes two rationalists, Saadia Gaon and Maimonides, and two anti-rationalists, or critics of rationalism, Judah Halevi and Chazdai Kreskas. I think it's important for Ravitzky to show that Jewish philosophy is not necessarily rationalistic or intellectualistic, and not necessarily critical of rationalism or intellectualism, but there's an option. Judaism offers an option to different philosophic ways of understanding it.
Mm-hmm. What was really for Ravitzky the relationship between Jewish philosophy and Western philosophy? You know, rationalism, anti-rationalism, these issues have been present in non-Jewish philosophy as well.
Well, Ravitzky thinks that Jewish philosophy concerns an encounter with the outside. For example, an encounter with the philosophy of Kant, an encounter with the philosophy of Aristotle. So you have an encounter with the philosophy of Aristotle, and you have Maimonides, who is an Aristotelian and a Jew, and a Jewish philosopher who is explaining Judaism within the terminology of Aristotle. Or you have...
Did they openly draw on
yes, of
Greek
course,
philosophers?
Of course. Mm-hmm. Or you have a philosopher such as Rosenzweig, Franz Rosenzweig. There's a chapter on him in the book, one of the great 20th century Jewish philosophers, who was a Hegelian philosopher. So Rosenzweig is developing his own system of Jewish philosophy in response to the philosophy, the German philosophy of Hegel.
And what makes it Jewish? Per se.
What makes us Jewish is that Jewish thought is the reflection, the critical reflection on Judaism or on the Jewish people or on Jewish culture. Mm-hmm. So what makes it Jewish, Ravitzky explains this in a story that he tells in the book. He says when he was a young scholar, he was visiting at a university in the United States, and together with him was a young doctor of physics who had studied also all his life in yeshivot. Mm-hmm. He had studied in the famous yeshiva of Panovich, a very serious Haredi. Mm-hmm. And so there was a reception at this university, and everyone ate. Ravitzky had some fruit, I suppose, which is kosher. Yep. But this young doctor of physics, who was a ultra-Orthodox, didn't have anything, as is normally what the ultra-Orthodox do at these receptions. And there was a young doctoral student from Japan there who asked him, "How come you're not eating anything?" And he said to Ravitzky afterwards, "I didn't know what to answer. I didn't know how to answer her." And Ravitzky says, that's the beginning of Jewish philosophy. When all of a sudden you have to answer, because for an observant Jew, observing the laws of kashrut, the dietary laws, are like breathing. Mm-hmm. But if someone asks, why are you observing those laws? Already, this is a question coming in from the outside. And Ravitzky is not so much worried about having to answer somebody from the outside. He's excited about the question coming in from the outside. This ultra-Orthodox physics doctor didn't really have a commitment to give a good answer to the student from Japan.
Few opportunities to reflect on that question before.
This was an opportunity for him. The exciting thing for him was that all of a sudden he was asked a question that he had to think about. He had never thought about that before. The beginning of Night by Elie Wiesel says, when I was young, we used to pray, and if someone said to me, why do you pray? I didn't understand it. It was like breathing. Mm-hmm. It was like breathing. So there are certain natural, internal Jewish things that one does. And Jewish philosophy is when something comes in from the outside. It could be spurred by Aristotle or by Kant or by a doctoral student from Japan. And all of a sudden you're asking yourself, why am I doing this? And that's the beginning of Jewish philosophy.
Right. What were the main sources of influence for Ravitzky's thought in the classic canon of philosophy?
In the book, he focuses on 4 medieval thinkers, namely Saadia Gaon, the great 10th century rationalist, Judah Halevi, who was writing in the early 12th century and who was a anti-rationalist, Maimonides, writing in the 12th century, who was the great intellectualist in the history of Jewish philosophy, author of The Guide of the Perplexed, and Chazdai Kreskas, writing in the 14th century, who was a critique of Maimonides. So he has these 4 Jewish philosophers, 2 rationalists, 2 critics of rationalism. Mm-hmm. And then he has a chapter on the Kabbalah, in which he speaks about Kabbalah as myth. It's interesting here that usually the philosophers take a negative attitude toward Kabbalah. Yeshayahu Leibovitch, who was a very strong influence on Ravitzky, Yeshayahu Leibovitch saw the Kabbalah as pagan and idolatrous.
Right.
On the other hand, someone like Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of the Kabbalah, believed that the myth of the Kabbalah somehow was able to touch the deepest levels of the human soul, far deeper than reason. According to Scholem, the myth of the Kabbalah was able to arouse powers inside human beings that the intellect was unable to reach. Mm-hmm. Ravitzky takes a view which is different from Leibovitch and different from Scholem. He says, if you want to understand the power of myth and why the Kabbalah is so important as myth, he says, let me tell you about what happened when my son was sick. He had a little son. When his son was a little boy, he said, my son was sick, and the doctor came in and prescribed some medicine. The son didn't want to take his medicine. So Ravitzky said, I had to think of a way to get my son to take the medicine. So I said to him, you know, there's a war going on in your body. There is a battle going on in your body. There are good soldiers and there are bad soldiers. Mm-hmm. And the good soldiers are fighting the bad soldiers. And the bad soldiers may win if the good soldiers don't get their supplies. And the supplies, this medicine that you have to take. So as soon as the child heard this, he says, okay, let me have my medicine quick so I can help those good soldiers win. So Ravitzky said, well, okay, I couldn't explain to the son about bacteria and cells and all these things that are going on inside the human body, but I could tell him about this war going on. That's myth. And the myth worked, and the son took the medicine and got better. Now, what we see from this is that Ravitzky thinks that Kabbalah is very important and that it's able to reach people and explain things to them that they can't understand rationally, but it's not a religion for adults. A religion for adults is reason. Philosophy is for adults. Kabbalah is also good, but not for adults.
And there's also another streak of interest in Ravitzky's work, and the title of the event on Thursday is The Engaged Intellectual. What role did political engagement play in his thought and teachings?
Ravitzky was extremely active as engaged intellectual. I have had the honor to know two engaged intellectuals who were deeply rooted in Jewish thought. One was the late Yeshayahu Leibovich, and one is Aviezer Ravitzky. And there's a big difference between Leibovich and Ravitzky. Leibovich is a prophet of doom, a admonishing prophet. When you hear Leibovich speak, you say, I could never think of saying something like that. You are shocked. And you're moved to action because it is so strange. It is so powerful. It's as if you were listening to Isaiah the prophet, or listening to Jeremiah the prophet, or listening to Ezekiel the prophet. Ravitzky is a different kind of engaged intellectual. He's not the admonishing prophet, but he's what we call in Hebrew the Shaliach Tzibur, the leader of the prayers. And the leader of the prayers is someone who's part of the congregation, who's chosen because he or she has a kol arev, has a pleasant voice. The Shaliach Tzibur represents the congregation. And when one hears Ravitzky speaking and presenting the case as an engaged intellectual, one says, that's exactly what I would like to say had I been able to phrase it so eloquently and so clearly and so compellingly. So you have these two different kinds of engaged intellectuals. You have the fierce, prophetic approach of Leibovich, and you have the pleasant, convincing, compelling, eloquent approach of Leibovich, of Ravitzky.
Do you think that the fact that there were both Jewish philosophers play into their public engagement and the different types of intellectual, the different roles that they played in the debate?
Yes, no question about it. Both of them refer all the time to Jewish sources. For example, Ravitzky very often referred to the fateful encounter in the book of Genesis, chapter 32, when Jacob has to meet Esau. He has the confrontation between Esau, and the Bible says Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Vayira Yaakov mo'od vayetzer lo. And Ravitzky often referred to this statement because Rashi explains, why is there a double thing? Why is there a double language? Why does it say Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed? So Rashi says there are two things. There are two problems. Vayira shema yehareg. He was greatly afraid of being killed. But then it says, vayetzer lo im yaharog hu et acharim. He was distressed because he might have to kill someone else. And these are the two existential problems in war, being killed and killing. And this is the political problem for Zionism. On the one hand, we want to survive in this land, and we want to live and to thrive and not to be killed. But we also want to live morally and not to have to kill others. And there's a tremendous tension. How is it possible to live and not be killed and also avoid harming others, avoid killing others, to find some way? And this Ravitzky many times would explain on the basis of this statement of Jacob. Jacob was greatly afraid. He was afraid to be killed. And he was greatly distressed that he would have to kill someone else. There's a statement in the end of the first part of the Kuzari where the rabbi explains to the king of the Khazar nation, he explains that the Jews are superior in a sense to the Christians and the Muslims. Because if we look around the world, we see that the Christians and the Muslims are at war all the time. The Christians are fighting, the Muslims are fighting, they're always at war. whereas we Jews aren't killing anybody. And then the king says to the rabbi, well, that's true, but you don't have the power to do it. Wait until you have the power. Ravitzky would say, that means wait until you have a state. Mm-hmm. The challenge of morality is when you have the power to act. It's easy to be moral when you're powerless in the diaspora.
Yeah.
But when you have a Jewish state, that's the test of Jewish ethics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's no coincidence that Leibovitch and Ravitzky lived and acted in Israel, in the state of Israel. Other than what you just, that little story that you just told now, what was Ravitzky's take on Zionism and the revival of Jewish statehood and nationhood in the 20th century?
The land of Israel has a focal place in the thought of Aviezer Ravitzky, and he wrote several books on the importance of the land in Jewish thought. And for him, the main thing about Zionism is the return of the Jewish people to the land. He was not an activist messianist. He was wary of messianism, and he was wary of many other kinds of political approaches. He himself was very active in Oz V'Shalom, the religious Zionist peace party Oz V'Shalom, and also later on in Netivot Shalom, and still later in Meimad.
Yep.
These three movements of
the left-leaning,
of the left part of the religious Zionism.
Yeah.
But he said, the Jews returning to the land of Israel, he said, it's like a lover returning to see his beloved after many years. Now, one can say, well, it's very simple. After many years not seeing his beloved, he has tremendous lust, tremendous desire, and he comes home, they embrace, and everyone lives happily ever after. But he said, it may not be that easy, because maybe after being away many years from his beloved, he has begun to fantasize and to idealize her and to put her on a pedestal and to think of her as being perfect. And then when he comes back to see her, he's afraid. He's not going to be able to touch her. He's not going to be able to speak to her because she's perfect and he's just a mortal. And this, he says, is the idea of the holiness of the land of Israel, that Jews are afraid of this holiness. Jewish philosophers have always spoken about two approaches to God: the love of God, which comes out of human strength, and the fear or awe of God, which results from human limitations. Mm-hmm. Ravitzky speaks about the love of the land of Israel and the fear or the awe for the land of Israel. That the land of Israel is not something that can be taken simply because it is so deep in Jewish culture.
Mm-hmm. All right, Professor Zev Harvey, I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. But thank you very much for all this and opening a window into the life and thoughts of Aviezer Ravitzky ahead of the event that will take place at the Leer Institute later this week on Thursday, January the 14th, upon the publication of the book Jewish Thoughts in the Teachings of Aviezer Ravitzky that was edited by Avinoam Rosenak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilad.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
מה הזמן מסמן לי? זה הכל שאריות של החיים. ולחיות את הרגע, להתחיל לאסוף את השברים. אולי יצא יותר, להתחיל קצת למען, להתחיל להסתדר ולעשות